All right. It's hit 4 p.m., so I guess I'm legally required to do this. All right, kia ora. My name's Josh. Thank you for coming to my talk today, to cell phone and back, UX research in the development of Shatter Remastered. Obviously, I wasn't going to let a syllable get in the way of an average pun. As we've established, my name is Josh. That's my Twitter @ if you have any questions or you want to reach out at any point after this or during. I'm not going to answer, obviously. Can't multitask. I'm an experienced games user researcher at PickPock, and I led the user research for Shatter Remastered that is now on Netflix, and Shatter Remastered Deluxe that's coming to console late 2022. That actually made me feel a lot better. Someone's looking out for me. All right, but obviously this didn't all happen just at me doing the research. I'm also part of a research team. This is them here. Shout out to Jono for letting me steal his slide that he used in his presentation. That's him over there. Very competent. All right. So a little bit of an explanation in way of the title, to cell phone and back. So essentially, we had our OG Shatter, a game that our studio developed and released in 2009. And that was a great game, beloved in the studio. And we struck up a deal, well, I had no involvement. A deal was struck up with Netflix to bring that to their mobile games platform. So originally Shatter was PS3 and PC, I believe. So we were then taking that game and putting it onto cell phone. And we then took Shatter Remastered, the mobile version, and we put it back onto PC and console. Hence the name, to cell phone and back. All right, I'll stop doing that. And I want to talk about this because it's quite a unique and I think interesting sort of scenario, you know. Not only taking an older game and remastering it, but also porting it at the same time, and then taking that remaster/port that's on mobile and putting that back onto PC and console. So I want to give a little look at this process from the perspective of user research, games user research, GUR as we call it. But before I get into sort of the project specifics, I would just like to give some background on what GUR is. So this is a nice little way of summing it up in a nutshell. The purpose of a GUR department is to contribute towards understanding of the player experience in order to be able to improve it. And that sounds great. I don't think anyone would think that's a bad idea. But how do we do that? So test early and often is pretty much, if you've ever spoken to someone who does my job, sort of go-to catchphrase. If you test early and you test often, you know, you get the most out of your research. But what does that look like? Well, like any social researcher, I'd have to say it depends. But what does it depend on? Well, a lot of things, spoilers. But a few things of particular sort of importance is the stage of development that the project is in. A method that lends itself well to, say, pre-production research doesn't necessarily translate to post-release or active development. For example, in pre-production, when there's no audience, they're very difficult to survey, believe it or not. It also depends on the research question and problem. Going back to a survey, not necessarily the best method to find out more sort of usability aspects, more around sort of attitudinal or how the player sort of thinks or feels about the game rather than their actual behavior. And also depends on resources and limitations. You know, there's only so many of us, although, you know, we're hiring, shout out. And limitations, and that's not only limitations with our own team, it's limitations with the teams we're working with, and that can be time or any other number of things that might come up. So what methods, though, specifically do we use for what problems and when? Well, here's a lot of information. So this comes from Game User Research, the book. We call it the GUR Bible in our department. Shout out. As I mentioned, stage of development is important, and it is broken down here, envisioning, design, building, releasing, post-release. I will note, though, this tends to be a little bit more specific to console environments. When you're dealing with mobile games, particularly sort of in a live service environment and things like that, post-release does not necessarily mean post-development, and as a result, it doesn't necessarily mean post-research. So, for example, for us, we might still continue using online surveys much later in the process. Another other considerations, like I touched on before, some methods are better for getting behaviors, what players do, attitudes, what players say or feel. Also qualitative, quantitative, overall question we're trying to answer. And this touches on a little bit of those limitations I talked about. Some take longer than others, and that can sort of lend itself to that consideration as well. And again, Shatter was pretty unique in that it was a remaster/port. So the envisioning and pre-prod stage was a little bit redundant for obvious reasons. So as we move forward, I will focus on three sort of methods we used in particular: usability tests, right testing, and I'll give a brief mention to heuristic evaluation as well. But before I get into that, just a quick bit of background on the original Shatter and what that is. So essentially, Shatter is a sort of Arkanoid, like a brick breaker game. It has some unique features, boss fights here. It also has a sort of physics system. You can sort of push and pull to affect your ball or objects in the play space. And as you can see, it was also quite well received when it was released. So, that's part of, I guess, why it was such a cool project, but also why we wanted to do our best. A little bit of pressure. All right. So Shatter Remastered, putting Shatter onto mobile to be released on Netflix. So the overall vision was to take Shatter's hypnotic and energetic breakout style experience to modern audiences. Great. That, again, sounds cool, but how do we do that? I've highlighted a couple of the goals that were sort of derived from that vision, the ones I feel are most relevant to Gur and our contribution. Retain and update the Shatter experience for contemporary audiences. So, making a game now versus 2009, people are used to sort of interacting with games differently and a different look as well, so that had to be considered. And make Shatter available on the devices contemporary users are playing on. And this was particularly relevant in this scenario because we were taking it from PC and console and putting it onto mobile, which is a very different device. You can quote me on that. So, actually, I'll just hydrate. Nice. So, in terms of making available on devices contemporary users were playing on, one thing, I guess, intuitively sort of seems like the first thing that we'd have to work on and focus on, and that is controls. So essentially, how did we get from this to sort of condensing that all onto your device? Couldn't help myself. So here we have some initial prototypes of different control schemes and different layouts that we sort of thought could potentially work. I say we, these were specifically put together by Chris Winning, who was designer on the project. Shout out to him. He did let me use these, so, that was nice of him. So, you can see we sort of started wide with a breadth of options around movement and mechanics. For example, joysticks to sort of like more trackpad styles to just using buttons and different layouts, some on the left, some on the right. I will give a spoiler, we didn't go with portrait. Came clear pretty quickly that wasn't going to work. Alrighty. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we conducted this research and the kind of research we conducted. Usability tests. So essentially, a usability test is a one-to-one observational technique in which participants attempt to perform a variety of tasks with a prototype or game in development. Specifically, what that looks like at Pickpock is, and this is a little look at our user testing lab. I have had to crop it to hide forbidden knowledge. But I will sit at this desk here. I will see what they're doing on the computer because they will be sitting on the sofa with this mobile with a camera mounted to it. Usability tests with external users tend to last for about 40 to 50 minutes. We compensate them with a $30 Visa Prezi card, thank them for their time. And through the process, we sort of watch how they interact with the game, sometimes ask questions, if there's anything frustrating or confusing, what they like, dislike, things like that. Sometimes it's more guided, sometimes less so, depending on needs. And this is sort of the bread and butter of the Go department. This is sort of what we do most often. But specifically, early in the project, when we're trying to narrow down all those control schemes, we opted for a very particular approach known as RITE testing. And RITE stands for Rapid Iterative Testing and Evaluation. It's pretty much what it says on the tin. It's a discount usability test conducted in a fast and highly collaborative manner. So what this looks like in practice is, while a standard test, we tend to run about 5 or 6 participants through the game, and then we report back to the team about our findings, and then the team makes changes, or doesn't. No tea, no shade. Whereas in a RITE test, we'd run a participant or maybe a few, make changes based on that, run participant, make changes, run participant, make changes, in a much faster sort of process, in an ongoing process. Cool. Actually, I'm just gonna, okay. So I'll go back to this. So what that looked like sort of specifically in context for us. This is an actual outtake from one of our schedules. So we tested 2 users on a Tuesday, iterated based on that, tested 4 users on a Thursday, iterated, actually that sounds like, is that Craig David? Anyway, 4 users the next Tuesday, iterated, and then another 4 users on that Thursday. So there's a couple of considerations that have to be taken into account that tie back to those points I touched on earlier. And one of these balances that we try to strike is the balance between rigor and pragmatism. In this context, rigor referring to how thorough and strict we are when we conduct the research versus the fact that, for the results to be actionable or useful, they actually have to be collected and presented to teams in a timely way. We can't be necessarily as rigorous as a university laboratory or someone who's doing like a PhD and has 3 years and can report at the end. We're in a business, and and that means that it's a little bit more time sensitive, and we have to take that into account. So there is sometimes a balancing act. And part of this is the decision between using internal users versus using external users. And there's a range of things to consider here, but I boiled it down to a few key points. There are a few benefits to using internal users. They are cheap in that we don't have to do any recruitment other than like walking up and asking someone if they have 20 minutes in the day to play a game. They're convenient because they work in the same building as us. They bring a game dev perspective. Now, this is an interesting one. It might seem initially as though that could be more of a positive. But one thing you have to consider when you are testing with internal users and with game devs in general is that when they come into a user test, they're also bringing their lens as a game dev. So while if I brought someone from outside game dev in, they might sort of more comment just on the general experience and how they're going. They might not have as much of a specific focus on things. If I were testing on, say, a UI artist, hey Larissa, they might tend to focus on that or give that more weight or comment more on that because that's something that they tend to pay attention to and that's their expertise. And because of that, they tend to be more useful for core usability, so like fundamental controls or mechanics. Versus external users, more expensive and time-consuming in terms of recruitment, and we do pay them. Not that we don't pay our staff. almost got me. They're more sort of, I guess, true users in terms of, they're not game dev, and we do have a database so we can select people who tend to play specific genres, play specific ways, like casual versus hardcore, stuff like that. And that means that they're sort of more valuable for more general usability and overall player experience. We can also have them for longer sessions. We pay them to be there. They opt in to be there for sort of 50 minutes or so. I can't necessarily take away one of my colleagues from their actual job for an hour, because then I'd get told off. Yes, so in the end, we opted for internal users because we were going for controls, and they were more accessible, and it lent itself quite well, actually, to this sort of faster cadence. We didn't have to worry about no-shows, things like that, which always sort of are a bump in the road. And by doing this, we quickly narrowed down what worked and what didn't. So we went from all of these, kind of minus the portrait mode, to this. To this. We managed to take all these controls and get them into this sort of handy-dandy layout. So, for example, we ended up with a sort of slider/joystick for movement, for that physics sort of push and pull I mentioned before, another slider. And then Shard Storm, it's just a combo move in the game. You also have a shield to protect you from bricks, and a button to launch extra balls. We realized pretty quickly that it made more sense to have movement on the left side and these mechanics on the right side, because as a brick breaker where you're constantly trying to hit the ball, you're going to be having your finger on movement almost constantly, whereas you don't necessarily need to use these all the time. So having them on the right side means that you can sort of go between them, but not just stop moving because you only have the regular hands. I'm sorry, there's no such thing as regular hands. All hands are beautiful. Or not. Great. But another thing that's always important to remember, while you might go in with a specific question, particular assumptions about what you think you will or won't find, you'll always find other things. There will always be other issues that come up that maybe you didn't foresee, or you weren't really interested in, but they're there. And so we found that actually there was a common issue with controls, just outside of format and stuff, and that was the speed. That was a real point of contention. So we found that originally the speed was too fast, and so some people found that was really compromising their ability to play the game, and obviously leading to a poor user experience. So we want to hone in on that a bit. And the way we did that was we ran more tests. Dramatic pause. We ran more tests, but in these tests, we gave players the ability to use debug to change the speed or sensitivity of the bat. And that's another point. We did end up opting for relative movement. So if you move your finger, the bat moves more than just what your finger. It's not one-to-one. The reason for this being because it was going onto mobile, it was actually also going onto iPads, and doing a one-to-one on an iPad is not fun. We found out. So we gave players the ability to use debug to change the speed. And this was great. We found a good average, sort of a good default speed. But something else we found was there was actually a fairly significant variation in speed preferences. And so the team decided to give the players the control over the bat speed. And this was, I guess, notable because this was a big or a significant departure from the original game. This wasn't a feature in the original Shatter, but given what we'd sort of observed, the designers and dev team decided, you know what, let's just dealer's choice, why not? And this was also exciting for me because not only is it sort of giving the players a little bit more control, it's also potentially useful as an accessibility feature. So if, for example, a player doesn't have as much movement in their finger, they can tune up the speed or sensitivity. So smaller movements can move the bat further, potentially making that game more accessible for more people, which is always nice. So, as I mentioned, we always come up across other issues, and there were a few things that sort of kept popping up. Number or the fact that lives exist was unclear. The shield button was unclear. The tap ability or activation of Shardstorm, that combo I mentioned, was unclear. And we realized that, there were some aspects of key learnings, these key aspects of gameplay that were sort of not necessarily translating well. So it made sense that our next tests would look at the nuff. So nuff is a little bit pickpock specific. It refers to new user flow. It's more common, I think, in the industry refer to the FTUI or first time user experience. Essentially, this is the tutorial, what sort of teaches the players how to play the game and how things work. And again, we came up to this question of, internal versus external. And because we're sort of moving away from that core mechanical usability around just using controls, and this was getting more into the realm, of UI elements and stuff like that, we needed more general experience, more general player experience, and learnability, and a longer time as well, because 20 minutes wasn't necessarily giving us the full picture of the player's sort of journey of learning or not learning those mechanics, and because of that, externals were ideal. In the interest of time, I won't go into too much depth, but essentially having external users and having them longer did allow sort of more detailed, nuanced perspectives on issues. So, for example, I mentioned that there were some issues with understanding the shield and shield mechanic. We were able to go a little bit deeper here. So, after observing a number of players in the game, there was sort of a pattern that emerged, and we realized that the trouble with learning that mechanic could potentially be attributed to the fact that early levels of the game actually had few moving hazards to shield from. So some players did eventually figure out what the shield was for, to protect them from hazards, but they discovered what it was useful for sort of on the first couple of stages of World 2. So, World 1 is where you learn all these things, World 2 is the next world, go figure. So presented this information to the team, and Chris sort of looked at it, stroked his chin, and was like, great, so what we need to do is just move it later. And he did. And it performed much better in one of the later levels in the first world, where there are a lot more bricks just coming at you. And again, as I mentioned, that Shardstorm combo not being noticed when ready. Players said that they often did not notice when it was full, and they forgot about it. And so what became clear there was, there had to be maybe a little bit more razzle-dazzle, for want of a better word, to really make it pop and to make it sort of clearer and more noticeable for players. That's part of the information that helped make Shatter Remastered what it is today. But that's a glimpse at Ger's role in developing Shatter Remastered. But from Shatter Remastered on mobile to Shatter Remastered Deluxe for console and PC, that was a different beast altogether. Again, controls obviously become a focus here because we are moving from mobile touchscreen to, interacting with it through a mouse and keyboard or controller. And there was also actually a mode in PC and console, Shatter Remastered Deluxe, that was exclusive to it and not present on the mobile, a co-op mode. And that was untested. So, those were two areas in particular that were unknowns and therefore sort of considered high risk. So we ran some tests on that, and there were also some other surprises, but we'll get to those. Again, we come to this question of rigor and pragmatism. And in this instance, it came down to time pressures. And one thing that initially happened was we didn't necessarily have a build that was in a state for testing with internal or external users due to a need for just refactoring, things like that. But there were still some ways that Ger could contribute even with it sort of in its present state. And one of these ways was with heuristic evaluation. So essentially, heuristic evaluation is a method by which experts inspect the target system using a set of guidelines to govern the evaluation. What this means in practice is, we play the game separately with some certain requirements in mind, like the users be able to navigate the menus easily, stuff like that. And it doesn't necessarily identify every issue, but you can catch some of the bigger issues and sort of head them off before you do get to that testing scenario, so they don't muddy the waters and get in the way of other insights. So here's a few examples. Highlight states on buttons. When you're navigating with the control, they were difficult to notice. They were really thin. So we told the team and they made them thick. It was great. Very satisfying day for me. Adjusting controller sensitivity. So on the mobile, people can just tap and drag. But on console, players had to tap for every single sort of like 0.1 increment, which felt very clunky. And also the co-op mechanics. Again, this was a new mode, or unique to that platform mode. And they're relatively complex mechanics in that they're different from the regular game. So for example, ball will take on the color of the last bat that it impacted, and then only that bat can sort of push and pull it with that gust. And so there was a question, how much of that is clear to players and how much should be surface, things like that. So essentially, it meant we could save time down the line. But then we still got through that process and we're ready for testing. We wanted to test on console. Again, we were interested in co-op mode and we were interested in controls. But again, we have limited time, so we couldn't necessarily test every control on every console and every arrangement. It wasn't feasible. Honestly, if it was, it would probably have done my head in. So we had to make some strategic choices. So we figured the game had already been on PC. The game had already been on PlayStation. So we and the team decided a lower risk. The controls already existed on those platforms that stood the test of time. So we weren't going to test the PC controls, and we weren't going to test PlayStation. We're down to Switch and Xbox, and we figured, the Xbox control is quite similar to the PlayStation control. So we decided not to do that one, which left the Switch. And also another aspect of what led us to the Switch was not just a process of elimination in terms of what did we already have or what we were more confident on. Switch was quite unique and the biggest unknown and presented the greatest risk, largely due to the fact that it has a number of control configurations and it was a platform that the game had not existed on before. So we tested on Switch. All right, so we get back to the internal users and external users, and you might notice, in addition to this, another consideration we had to make was COVID. So unfortunately, this was last year when COVID was being particularly spiteful, and so COVID safety had to be taken into consideration. And because we're also testing a co-op mode, either we brought in two people from the outside into the studio who either might know each other or not know each other. So we could be potentially putting them at risk and putting people in the studio at risk. It was not our ideal situation, and we were quite risk averse for obvious reasons. So the decision was made to go with internal users, and the peers I recruited, I actually made sure worked on the same floor as the building because there wasn't movement between the floors at that point, just to ensure that, we're being as safe as possible. And we also, this was our room setup that we sort of did on the fly. Shout out to one of our teams. We actually stole this space from them. Well, we were allowed to, but that we did displace them, unfortunately. And the reason for this was, again, a room that only the testers would be in, also a lot of space. So they'd sit at these tables here, and I was all the way over here watching on my computer. So we also had them wearing masks, disinfecting the controllers between tests and stuff, which we, obviously do with external testers and stuff as well. But, extra measures taken. But we wanted to make it we wanted the test to be as representative as possible of what we considered to be like a real life situation. And discussing it with the team, what we felt was one of the most likely scenarios is an experienced player and a less experienced player, right? This idea of like there's someone who owns the game, they have a friend over, and that friend doesn't necessarily know the game, but they're playing it as well. And so there was a little bit of a discussion about like how do we manufacture this situation? And so what I did was essentially I broke up my testing into 2 days. So I had several pairs, and one member of the pair would come in on the first day. They would play on the Switch with the Joy-Cons on the side. They would play with the Switch Pro controller, and they would play through the first world. This allowed us to look at the controls, gave another look at the NUF. But it also meant that we were creating, the experienced player. So that player and the other player would then come in on the second day. I would also give that experienced player a look at a sheet that just showed the controls again, just to refresh them to make sure they were our experienced player. And our testers played using Switch Pro, Joy-Cons mounted on their little control dock, and then single Joy-Con each. And by doing that, we sort of hope to recreate that sort of situation where you've got one player who knows how to play the game and is sort of coaching the other through it, and that less experienced player, just as a way of being like, okay, what's easy to understand and teach, what isn't? Like, is there stuff we need to be telling that second player? And if so, what interventions might that need to involve and things like that. Fun fact, turns out the controls were fine. It was great. We loved that. Outside of physical ergonomic factors, players found switching between control schemes felt easy. And when I say outside of physical ergonomic factors, what I mean is playing on a single Joy-Con is straight up garbo. Like, it's not good. Sorry. Yeah, so that was great. That was one thing that really sort of put us at ease a little bit. However, as mentioned before, some of our biggest sort of key findings weren't actually specific to the controls in controls or co-op mode, and they spoke to design considerations and potential problems that could arise when moving from mobile to console or PC. And a lot of this stems from the fact that. So I described it as shift from mobile screen to TV screen causing usability and readability issues. Specifically, what this means is that we made Shatter Remastered, developed it for mobile screens. They're small. You can see most of the information out of your peripherals, and if you want to look to get information, it's a very small movement of the eye. However, when that translates to a television or a larger screen, that same information isn't necessarily as accessible through peripheral vision or the movement of the eyes, particularly if you're playing Shatter and all your action is there. And for example, your energy bar or the boss's health might be up there. It's suddenly a lot more distant from your field of view. And that's something that has to be taken into consideration because that can affect, key learnings, things like that. So that was one consideration that had to be taken into account by the team when making that jump. Then the next issue was around level orientation. So for a little bit of background, there are 3 sort of level orientations in Shatter. The sort of rectangular one, we're on the side, more of a square one, we're on the bottom, and the circular one where you travel between these 2 points on the bottom. And when we tested on mobile, we did find that players had trouble when moving from that to that or that to that. But we sort of just attributed to the fact that they were playing on a different sort of level than what they were used to, right? They were just adjusting to a new play space, things like that. But what became quite clear when we were testing on console was that there was actually a difference in speed of the bat between these levels. And the players reported that and were quite aware of that. And it felt bad to them, which is not good. So this was an interesting finding. And we realized that this issue actually might have been present in the mobile tests. We just didn't necessarily realize. And after sort of thinking, looking to this for a bit, it sort of became clear why that might be the case. And it comes down to the difference between human hands and controllers. There's several, I know, but I'll clarify. Essentially, hands have quite fine motor movement, and so when players were going to a new stage, and if there was a difference in speed, it's relatively easy for them to compensate on mobile. They have a greater sort of ease of changing speed, things like that. But there's an added layer of abstraction when you use a controller. It's harder to sort of compensate for maybe those issues, and it's more of an issue. Which raised the question, how do you solve that? Well, I decided, let's just get to the bottom of understanding how speed works. I say I needed to understand how speed works. So I went and spoke to one of our fantastic programmers, Sammy. Hey. Just to understand, better how that sort of worked in the game. So this was kind of funny, actually, in the end. So it actually turned out that there were unused variables in the game for the speed on the different level orientations. We just, I guess, hadn't been using them. We hadn't had cause to use them. So, the solution then became find a suitable default for each level orientation, and problem relatively solved. Again, I won't give an exhaustive rundown of specifics, but this sort of offers, I guess, some insight into the value, the contribution of GER in testing development. And again, the interesting quirks of moving to cell phone and back. I couldn't resist. Great. Now I'm going to wrap up shortly because I am getting low-ish on time. But before I do, I just want to quickly jump back to mobile and Shatter Remastered. As mentioned earlier, mobile games especially are quite interesting because, they're often live service. Research doesn't end at release. And in fact, one of the great things about post-release stage is that you then have access to an audience. And one of the benefits of this is analytics. Woo! I also stole this from Jono. And this is our analytics team. They're really cool. That's it. They're great. So yeah, shout out to the amazing Pickpock analytics team. Once released, we have access to analytics. Analytics is a great resource. And for us in particular, they could identify potential avenues of research or things we need to look into. And one tool that really helps with this is the funnel. This is quite verbose, but funnels are a way of visualizing and measuring how your players move through a sequence of events or steps. A well-configured funnel gives insight into which of these steps lose the most players, whether your paths to conversion are optimized, and whether your players are progressing through your game as intended. So essentially, a funnel is a way to show, at what point in the game, say between stage 3 and 4 or 5 and 6, things like that, your players are leaving or churning, as we call it. So what did the funnel for Shatter Remastered look like? Can't tell you. That is forbidden knowledge, unfortunately, because of our relationship with Netflix. But I can tell you that looking at the data did show some areas with significant drops. And what that indicated for us is that there was some element of the user experience or what players were going through that was less than optimal and causing them to leave the game. What that meant for us was that these were areas that we could sort of look at in the future. We used it to inform future research, to understand the issue and what was happening there, because, analytics there could tell us what, but not necessarily why. We could reach assumptions, but again, those were coming from our perspective. And having that, seeing a player play through and actually seeing them run into those issues is very powerful and really helps you empathize with and better understand the problem. And ultimately results in better informed decision making. So yeah, from PC and console to cell phone and back, hopefully I've been able to give you some interesting insights into how GER helped inform the development of Shatter, Shatter Remastered, and Shatter Remastered Deluxe, and sort of how we got from this to this. But as I said, post-release does not mean post-research. The wheel continues to spin. Researchers continue to research. Our work is never done. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed my talk today. And look, if there's only one thing you take away from this talk, please, just on behalf of all game user researchers, test early and test often. Thank you.
We've got time for a few questions.
Yeah, like humble brag, but I hit exactly 40. Nice. Any questions? Yeah.
Right.
Hey, do you use much online user testing, like usertesting.com or that sort of thing?
No, to put it shortly. But no, we don't usually. The reason for this is we have explored online testing for mobile games. Most of our games are mobile. But unfortunately, the software at the moment and with the sort of power of phones currently, the streaming isn't necessarily what we want or need to really get that smooth movement. We are exploring it for sort of more PC or console titles. We're looking into things like Parsec and stuff like that. But when it comes to mobile currently, our best options really are just the in-person user tests. It's not necessarily perfect, and one day it would be nice to be able to do that. But with the tech where it is at the moment, we've found that it's not necessarily the effort to reward, doesn't really work out in our favor. Yeah. Anyone else?
Is your research mainly focused on finding frustrations and problems, or do you sort of wander into engagement and sort of what drives people in the gameplay as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. It sort of, I think, boils down to sort of that distinction between behavioral and attitudinal. A lot of what I talked about was behavioral in terms of, what a player's doing. But we do have a lot that we get into in terms of attitudinal. I mentioned surveys a couple of times, and that's a big tool or a significant tool in that process, in that, we have a lot of games that are live either in soft release or hard launch, soft launch or hard launch. Got it. And surveys are a great way that we can get more of an understanding of general player sentiment, what their goals are in the game, because while we might have an idea of what we want players to be doing, that's not necessarily what's in their heads. And so, we do have other methods that we use to get that kind of information. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Cool. What a flex.
Hey, I was wondering about the rapid iteration testing.
Absolutely.
Because there's probably a temptation to try and change heaps of stuff at once, but it's not so useful as a testing strategy. How did you handle that? Do you basically build up a backlog of slow changes, or did you iterate quite a lot at once and just test a bunch of stuff?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, like I said, it's not I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for more nuanced or smaller issues. It's really useful when you have a clear goal, right? If you're going in thinking, I want to look at sort of key learnings, things like that. It was actually pioneered, I believe, at Microsoft with the development of one of the Age of Empires games, and they sort of had people going through the tutorial and stuff like that. And so when it's those bigger things where issues are a lot clearer and a lot more contained, so yeah, controls, for example, that's good. But yeah, I would say, there needs to be a little bit of discipline to not sort of let your scope creep, I guess, too much. But that being said, you can use some of those other issues that might come up to potentially inform future avenues of research, and give an idea of what might be there. Because because I guess an important point to note too is that the results of usability tests and things like that are not meant to be statistically significant. They don't tell you what will happen; they tell you what could happen, and that's, I guess, sort of an important aspect of it too. Does that? Cool. Anyone else?
I have a question. Yep.
Hit me.
With the right method, you mentioned the trade-off between the rigor and the pragmatism, and unless you're doing 3 years in a PhD, you can do the rigor thing. Well, as someone who's doing a PhD for 3 years,
I do not envy you.
yeah, the rigor is a big thing, and I noticed with the right how instead of doing like a whole group of testers, kind of getting the average findings, you're doing one and iterating. How do you know if like the first 1 or 2 users aren't just the edge cases? And so you've iterated like the game in a new direction based on like, just the one user. Like what kind of factors into that kind of trade-off decision?
Yeah, it's a few things, right? I guess one thing in terms of context is I often, well, not just me, I read it somewhere. An analogy that's often used is, what QA is to tech, games user research is to design, while QA verifies tech intent, like the tech is sort of performing the way it's meant to. GURS, or games user research, sort of verifies that the design is working the way it's meant to. So, for example, if you put a game in front of a person and they play it and the design doesn't work in the way that the designer wanted it to, then the fact that that is possible is the important piece of information there, not necessarily, how statistically common or whatever that might be, if you get. So does that make sense? Yeah. And the other thing too, is the fact that, if you're watching a player play your game and they're using their tongue or something, I mean, that's obviously a pretty out there example, but if you can tell to some extent, if a player is engaging with the game in a particularly unusual way. So, the discretion comes into that. And in terms of what gets actioned or what doesn't, like it's never, like a missive or a directive from our teams to the dev team, that, and that's the value and the importance of that second part of that right definition about the sort of designer being embedded in the research team somewhat. That close relationship means you get to have that conversation and you get that balanced perspective on like, is this something that is considered like a real and present issue, or do we think that this is more of an edge case? And sometimes that might be more of a judgment call, but it's one that you sort of make with that broader context of your team that you're working with, as opposed to just the researcher being like, that's wrong.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one. I'm grateful when I'm interested in specifically games experiences that UX and how people go is I'm not for a year.
Oh, dope. Good on you. Man, everyone here's so smart.
But basically, my question was, and I mean, yeah, I don't know if that you know, more comment, but you talked about, this tension obviously between rigor and pragmatism, and that's something that goes throughout all UX, I think, not just games. But I guess one thing that came to mind was for including internal people, they might not have the accessibility requirements that are out there in the general population. So how do you, I guess, rectify that and include people that way? So things might come out in the general population, for example, that you might not have thought about, but because of the idea that you get, that could, send you down lots of different avenues or transport you to user experience. So I guess if you could just talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, so would it be fair to say that it's sort of around sort of like testing with an accessibility focus?
Yes, and how do you do that possibly with internal people? Like how do you kind of go around that pragmatism?
For sure. Look, that's a great question. It's a bit of a complicated one. There are some things that we are able to test in terms of accessibility internally. It's going to sound like a weird sentence, but fortunately we have a few colorblind people in the studio, which is great, because, it makes it a lot easier to do those sorts of passes with them and things. And, we did do sort of like a color blindness pass for Shatter because, there are a lot of colors. The colors and the art got updated, sort of more of a vaporwave aesthetic. And so, we're able to use those people as a sense check. I mean, there are obviously tools that do that as well. When it comes to broader accessibility testing, I mean, I personally wouldn't necessarily recommend using internal testers for that, but it also depends on what you are testing for, if that makes sense. So, in our database, for example, if we were targeting for specifically like hard of hearing people, we have a database of about 1,400 people. So, with that sort of spread, we do have like a few things like that well represented. But look, I will say that specifically testing with accessibility in mind is something that we're still working on, our processes aren't perfect, and none of our approaches are like foolproof or anything like that. And yeah, to be perfectly frank, that is one area that we're sort of trying to work on. I think on a studio-wide level is just sort of really considering and baking in considerations around accessibility from the very beginning. So I don't know, that might not be a super satisfying answer. It's kind of more of a watch this space and I'll get back to you. Thank you. Yeah, anyone else want to give it a hoon?
Thank you, Josh.
Amazing. Just before I wrap up, if you're interested in giving it a go, Shatter Remastered Deluxe is part of the Kiwi Interactive Showcase on Level 2. Thank you.